Hey everybody. As promised, I'm back for round two with Brian Culkin, author of several books, including On Heroin. Um, this is going to be a freewheeling conversation, so hang on. We'll probably visit a few areas that are of real interest to some of you. So, last night I read the first chapter of Han's Psychopolitics.
Very important book.
Yeah, and it got my head going. And I thought a couple topics so we could kind of just launch off of. One was his idea that that like in an earlier time, an earlier surveillance state, the state would have to furtively or surreptitiously spy on us. And whereas now, we just give them, we freely and willingly give them total access to our private lives.
Yes.
And then the other side of that is that it's like the internet turns us inside out, and yet and what it seems to want, what the hyper modern agenda, whatever you want to call it, wants, is our very interiority.
Yes.
So it's like that's this one place where if we're mindful or vigilant or take care of it, we can stake a certain freedom.
Yes.
Silence, if you will, things like that.
Sure.
So I think that's really, really interesting because, you know, I can remember being a drug user in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And I was always kind of worried about the man and getting busted and being careful and this, that, and the next thing. And now it really is true. I watch these clients of mine and they're just buying drugs, you know, off the deep web. They're going to the doctor, you know, feigning ADD or something. You know, it's just like, which of course is leaving a paper trail. It's like they're just going to let you be a drug addict and just collect all the data.
Yes. That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that, but that's an interesting point. That's an interesting point. So just in case anyone didn't know who the author was, Pierce and I are referring to a German Korean, he's half German, half Korean, theorist named Byung-Chul Han, who's written a series of short theoretical texts, and specifically the one he wrote, I believe it came out in 2016 or 17. It's called Psychopolitics. And yes, chapter 1 of that book, it talks about freedom, or the idea of freedom, and how freedom manifests itself in different ways depending upon the political and social and technological context. And you know what we have now in 21st century hypermodernity or 21st century global capitalism is a situation in which we think we've never been freer. Like, at least that's what we tell ourselves, you know. There's so many opportunities. Han actually, I believe further into the book, he says one of the great ideological lines to make people fooled was the Microsoft commercial of the late 90s. And the tagline was, "Where do you want to go today?" And it spoke to this sense of freedom. And of course, it's a completely false freedom in one sense, but also, you know, let's be honest, getting on the internet and, you know, going on YouTube, I mean, there is something freeing about that, right? But there's a whole dark side too that we're not fully conscious of. And there's also like a common sense side, like sitting in your room by yourself, surfing on the web isn't exactly a shining example of human freedom. So what Han talks about in that book, and really throughout his work, is this new sense of quote unquote freedom that we've been told, that we've been given in the 21st century, is really like a new form of entrapment. it's a new form of really slavery in a way, you know. And to your point, this just doesn't happen in surfing on the web. I think I mentioned this in the last conversation. One of the ways that we express our freedom today is through the cultural phenomena of getting tattoos. You know, if you were to get a tattoo in the 1940s, this would signify that you were an outsider. You were a circus performer or a sailor, maybe even a criminal or a biker. You were somebody living on the periphery. Whereas today, the inscription of a tattoo on the flesh is like, you're the star professional athlete. You're an investment banker on Wall Street. You're a model for GQ. I mean, you're right in the heart of the system. So Christopher Lasch, who I've been reading a little bit lately, has this one of his books is called The Revolt of the Elites. And this is like this revolution of the revolution. And this is something that Han touches upon, but Han's writing is more focused on the technological aspect of things, in the sense that, yes, we can do what we want now. We can post crazy screeds on Twitter. We can, wear crazy clothes, and we can have transgender bathrooms, and we can, ink ourselves up with tattoo. But in a way, we're less free than we've ever been in our lives, and just to speak to my own personal experience, I was an American history major in college, so I do have a great respect and a great admiration for American history in a very broad sense, even though I'm well aware of all the problematics that are being uncovered right now. And it's very important that I think that we do uncover them. But, one of the things that we are told about America, like one of the things that we're told about ourselves and our experience of as Americans is that like we're free, right? And like we're like this unique national identity of nations, in the sense that we put this precedence on freedom. And it wasn't until I got down to Peru and I was like, going on a motorboat in the middle of the Amazon jungle that I was like, wow, this is freedom. This is actual freedom. And growing up in like suburban Boston, that was like a Foucauldian prison. That wasn't free at all. So I think it's very important. And of course, to speak of the drug experience, I mean, being an alcoholic or some kind of drug addict in capitalist America is probably the height of non-freedom to a point.
Right.
So I think it's important that as 21st century Americans, and especially with this moment that we're having right now, this moment that we're having, it's really interesting how when you look at the discourse on the right and the discourse on the left, how dishonest both sides are to a point. Both kind of say some good things and both kind of say some things that are just hideously incorrect. So I think it's important that we try to re-theorize or rethink about what it means to be free, and particularly in a country like America, where we put such a precedence on the idea of what it means to have freedom, what it means to be a free subject.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing that he does that's quite stunning, is he sort of tracks a kind of eclipse of religion, eclipse of the church, a brief period of time where there's sort of a void where the big other was, but then the reemergence of capital.
Sure.
So capital's the new transcendent.
Yes.
We are subjects of capital. And
like techno-capital, though, it's kind of like this. It's like this immaterial digital network capital that kind of is always looming in the background, and that's very different than the capital of the factory.
Yes,
which is what he I mean, that's the real thing. Most Americans still think we live in like an industrial society where men work in. I mean, I always see these ads on Facebook. It's like, do you want to escape the 9-to-5 work? And it's like, who works in a 9-to-5 anymore? Like, no one does. You know what I mean? It's like, we still have this fantasy that, men still go out and work 9-to-5. I mean, it's like, we're not conscious of this new paradigm that we live in. And this is what Han draws our attention to, is that we're not living in the 1950s anymore. We're not living in this disciplinary Foucault-like apparatus. We're living in this new wilderness of networked globalization. And yes, capital is this kind of invisible network monster that is hanging in the background, tracking and quantifying and surveilling and monitoring our total experience. I mean, like all of it, you know, so this is what we have to account for. And, you know, you look, I think, and this is a perfect example, you know, America, like this kind of deregulation and this, this freedom, for lack of a better word, that has been given to American capitalism, look what it produces. The high point of American capitalist freedom is Google producing these surveillance technologies that are like the antithesis of freedom. They are the opposite of freedom. So there's always this paradox, or I should say dialectical reversal in anything. You get this freedom and it turns into this kind of prison state. You get this sense of deregulation and it becomes regulated. So this is what we have to be conscious of. And this is what I think all these figures on the left, like, as much as I appreciate Sanders and AOC, I mean, they miss this. So, I mean, they do not talk about this. And this is what they really have to talk about, because they're so stuck. I mean, they're being drawn into this very toxic cancel culture, which is so problematic in so many levels, even though it emerges from I would say, an ethical or moral position. It's being totally distorted right now. So this is what we have to really talk about.
Then if we're going to go down that road, I think we need to define cancel culture for the audience.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't want to get sidetracked because that's a whole different conversation. But I mean, cancel, you're asking what I think cancel culture is?
Yeah, just a rule of thumb definition.
Well, I mean, I do think, like I said 2 minutes ago, there is something about wanting to fix and remedy and address the past that is righteous, that is honest, that comes from a good place. But I mean, cancel culture is a symbolic process. You know, I remember a month ago when people were saying, now all we want to do is take down the Confederate statues. And to me, that's like, yes, we should take down the Confederate statues. There's no business of Confederate statues being in public places, especially in southern cities where there's such a legacy of racism. But that, like, cancel culture has like a snowballing logic where it all of a sudden went to like, you're taking down statues of Ulysses S. Grant and Abraham Lincoln. And what I don't think people realize is that there's like there's a motion to that is not fully conscious, that there's not a full consciousness of the knowledge that's trying to be spoken. So, I mean, my feeling is that, yes, there is something about canceling things, quote unquote, in the past that has a good, righteous, moral element to it. But the idea that can't get away from itself and turn into something else, I mean, that's very naive. Very, very naive.
What's really interesting is when you think about it, you know, I did a lot of research on the Opium Wars and the relationship between England and the United States and China and heroin and blah, blah, blah. And it went for quite a while. And one of the things that's so evident today is that, you know, a lot of Americans can't tell you who the president was, you know, 4 presidents ago.
Oh, there's unbelievable historical illiteracy in America. Unbelievable.
Whereas in China, you know, even the peasant to the executive, they all know about the century of humiliation. They all know what the Opium Wars and the subsequent dislocation did to their country. So, you know, it's very interesting when you annihilate the past. I mean, this is what's really fascinating about Han, actually, is on the one hand, we're saying we have this cancel culture, which is saying, you know, it's scapegoating the past and erasing the past at the same time. But on the other hand, you've got, because of digital surveillance and these algorithms, we're foreclosing the future.
Yes.
Because it's all being determined by the needs of capital.
Sure.
And so what's left in between is this
Real time.
Yeah,
What's left in between is the real time of a Twitter feed. That's what's left in between. So it's like we're living in this this atemporal historical space right now where we're disconnected from the past, we're disconnected from the future, because they've both been in their own way a little bit differently, but they've been foreclosed by the combination of capital and technology. And now we're left with this ahistorical Twitter feed as our base of knowledge.
which really takes us back to in a way, to the tattoo and just the digital signification of who I am. I mean, that seems to be what's left of identity. Like I think Han even talks about it as we become Facebook likes.
Yes.
And we're
identity is being eviscerated, of course, and across the planet, because identity, healthy identity, is always produced by land first and foremost. It's produced by the connection to a living community that has a living relationship to a topology. Now, whether that's a urban neighborhood or more preferably a rural-like setting where people can know the land and know the river and know where they, like, for instance, people that live in the Amazon jungle don't have questions about their identity, like right. Zero. Like they all know who they are. Yeah. But the point is that who they are is not that big of a deal. They're living beings that have a network of relationships that are mediated both by the land and the community that they're part of. Whereas in America, in this kind of hyper consumer culture that we live in, where people are so immersed into the web, have very, very limited connection to the land as like a living phenomenon. It's more like, let's go for a walk in nature type of thing, right? Like the whole right. idea of having a living relationship to a topology doesn't really exist in America. It's just like, hey, let's go for a walk through the woods, which isn't the same thing. It's
that's totally
still different.
That's still a consumerist mindset.
Totally, it's a total capitalist mindset. So when you have that, what comes up to fill that is this kind of narcissism, is this kind of hyper activated, for lack of a better word, ego. So, one of the things that we have to realize is that in a narcissistic culture, you can't really have social justice, because social justice is based on love and compassion and mercy and decency. So when you look at the social justice of the American left today, I mean, it is so narcissistic, it's unbelievable. Even though they're yes, I will admit, they're saying some good things and no one's denying that, but it comes from such a unbelievably narcissistic place that one has to question, like, where does this go? Like, where are you leading us here? And
well, I don't think it doesn't appear to go anywhere.
No, I mean, I think America right now is heading into some kind of dispersed civil war, and it's not like it's certainly not like what happened in the 1860s, because what happened in the 1860s was divided in a very symbolically literate way. Southern had gray suits on, Northern had blue suits on. It was divided by a certain geographical line, that whereas today it's more like a Hobbesian war of all against all. It's
what's so interesting with this is, with the narcissism, I mean, Han is getting at this too, is what we've done is we've internalized competition. We've internalized the engine of capitalism. Sure. And so even in these ideological debates, I mean, sometimes within the same, left or right community, what you're seeing is people competing with each other to be the most ideologically pure.
Yeah,
and you're not debating the topics in any meaningful way. It's certainly not research-based, but you're posturing yourself, you're signifying your purity, whether that be left or right or what have you.
Yeah, and capitalism is actually based on like a hard truth of the universe. It's based on, the capitalism works because it's based on something that's true, which is the idea that human beings are incomplete. They're not they don't coincide with themselves. They're ontologically inconsistent.
Right.
And that remainder is what we call desire, right? We, like, our whole existence as human beings is this desire to be complete, this desire to be whole. And the whole mechanism of something like capitalism is a system designed to perpetuate that desire, right? It's like this, it's what Todd McGowan calls this promise of the future, right? So when capitalism first started to develop in the 18th century, it was very elementary because it was emerging from the ruins of feudalism. And now it's gotten to the point where it's so sophisticated, it can like literally program the future through computational algorithms. So we're coming to without question, a big old crisis. And what I've noticed about, you know, someone like Bernie Sanders, who, by the way, I generally supported, you know, like I wanted him to win. But what I noticed about him towards the end was like, wow, this guy is like, he's like fanning the flames of desire, but in a different way, right? It's like, so I think that the truly anti-capitalist movement or the truly humane movement is somebody that addresses this problem about human beings, which is desire. This fundamental problem that we have. And of course, the American right just, you know, lights gasoline on it every single day. And certainly something like Silicon Valley and Wall Street and all of these, I guess you could say, at least they identify as liberal political agencies. They're, you know, Jesus, I mean, dynamite and, you know, like nuclear bomb of desire in Silicon Valley. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed at some point in the future, without question. And I think as we become more aware and conscious of who we are or what we may be, there will be a political movement to address that at some point in the future. When it comes, I don't know, but it's certainly not being addressed by even the most progressive elements of the American left right now.
Well, if you were to look at it theologically, somebody like Althusser, the death of God guy, he would say that what it has to happen first is it has to be prophetic, meaning where we need to go or this new horizon, it has to emerge in a kind of organic, like you're saying, in a you know, not necessarily tied to the land, but it emerges organically, and it's not even political at first.
No.
It's a felt sense, and it needs to be broad-based and widespread.
Yes.
And then the politicians and the activists will follow in its wake.
Yes.
I suspect that's happening. I mean, you know, it's so interesting when you talk about the lands. This is this theme. So you ever read Derek Jensen?
I read Endgame several years ago, but I don't quite remember it. But
Well,
of course, I know who he is.
Yeah, so he makes this really strong statement that, you know, we're not even properly a culture, we're a civilization. And the reason why we're not a culture is we don't have this organic connection to the land.
Yes.
You know, in America especially, we're, save the remnants of the Native Americans, we're post-indigenous. And what's so interesting about this is if you look at Bruce Alexander and addiction, what he points out, some Native American activists do this too, is cultures that have this deep resonance with the land don't have addiction. And, you know, that seems like profound, but no one ever really unpacks that. So the more that we're connected to the land, the more embodied we are, the more neighborhood we are, the more village we are, the more we know our neighbors, the more we know the flora and the fauna and the past and so on and so forth. That awareness is increasing from where I sit anyway, around addiction. People are beginning to go, you know, addiction's not some hazard of being human. Addiction is actually something that occurs in this sort of dislocated setting, which is becoming, you know, hyper now.
Sure.
And I think people are finally beginning to see that their behavior, shopping and surfing, is every bit as addicted as plunging a syringe in your arm.
Sure. Yeah.
So this awareness is emerging, but I think it's still at that kind of prophetic level. Which is kind of what resistance recovery is trying to be, is it's trying to generate that conversation, that awareness.
I think what you just said is very, very, very intelligent and very important. This idea that, not, saying what we really need is some kind of prophecy or some kind of, I would 100% agree with that what planet Earth needs right now is prophets. We don't need really politicians anymore. We need prophets. We need visionaries, but really prophets, because what a prophet does is they see across the symbolic order. They see something that no one else can see, right? So I think like the order goes like prophet, artist, philosopher, and then very last is politician. The prophet sees it first. The artist comes in, or the writer comes in and puts it into symbolic text. Then comes the philosopher who like theorizes it in like a very formal way. And then last but not least is always the politician, their way at the end. And then, I think maybe actually, let me reframe that. It goes prophet, artist, philosopher, scientist, politician. I mean, even something like relativity. I mean, let's not forget, Picasso discovered relativity 15 years before Einstein did. I mean, Cubism is entirely relativistic. And then Einstein didn't write the general theory of relativity until the mid 1920s. So, I mean, the artist always comes first, and the prophet comes before the artist. And then just to add on to what you're saying, one of the things that Han talks about as well is that one of the powers that human beings have is to say no. Capitalism, especially this kind of network Tony Robbins capitalism, is based on saying yes 24/7.
Right.
It's entirely based on yes. And what does that yes mean? It means, yes, I want my desires to be fulfilled. Yes, I want to, quote unquote, live my best life, which, by the way, is a totally fraudulent statement. It means nothing in a capitalist environment. It means something if you're outside of that. I mean, we all want to live our best life. There's nothing wrong with that. But the moment you're in like this big arena and Tony Robbins is giving a seminar, it literally means nothing. It's actually a dangerous statement. So we have forgotten this thing that we can say, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to participate in that. And there's tremendous power in that. And this is why I think so many theorists and philosophers and great thinkers over the past 100 years have been very attracted to Herman Melville's novella, Bartleby. And it's a short story or novella about a kind of a copier who lives on Wall Street and works for this law firm on Wall Street. And his line that he keeps saying is, "I would prefer not to." That's like the famous line. And, people have like t-shirts as "I would prefer not to." And someone like Zizek has commented on this many, many times. And what is so interesting about that short story is that the power Bartleby has is by refusing to participate. Like that's the authentic power that he has. And this is the power that I think human beings, and particularly Americans of the 21st century, have refused, or not refused, have forgotten that they have. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go off the grid and live in like some commune in Montana. I mean, you can do this living in Boston or New York. It's like you can say, "I would prefer not to. I would prefer not to go out and spend all my money at a expensive dinner that I don't need," or I would prefer not to go out and whatever, participate fully in the capitalist dimension to temporarily fulfill these desires that will inevitably become empty and need to be filled in a week or two or whatever, Yeah. So this I think is the power that human beings have to tap into, which is the power of saying no. I would prefer not to.
Because I think it can extend into some very, very interesting areas. Like it could also be, I refuse
to do heroin.
Yeah, it could be that.
Yeah.
Or I refuse to engage in the COVID debate under the terms that have been put forth.
Absolutely.
So I refuse. So it's really interesting because it's like speaking to this sort of stunning power of silence. I'm thinking of Christ's silence in front of Pilate, actually, this sort of overwhelming refusal. But then it does also relate to this, I guess it's Han. It relates tangentially to things like friendship not being about usefulness.
Yes.
It's a refusal to, yeah, I think that we're on to something here.
Well, that's part of the transformation that came along in the 80s and 90s with the relationship or the linkage of capitalism with technology. Like when that happened, this is such an important point that so many people don't understand. The moment capitalism became, I mean, I think personally that you could defend capital, even though for me, I'm not a huge fan of capitalism, but I think it's possible to defend capitalism before the 1980s. It's not ideal, but I mean, you can make a defense for it. But the very moment capitalism becomes linked to microelectronic technologies and digital networks, it becomes indefensible. I mean, it becomes such a monster that no sane human being could possibly, if you really understood what it was, it's not possible to defend it, because at that moment, it can do what it's always wanted to do, which is to make every single element of human life monetizable, instrumentalized, and set into a network of equivalence and exchange. Before the 1980s, you couldn't do what Facebook has done to friendship. It would be impossible.
No,
People were still, like, if you walked into, Manhattan in 1978 or 75 or 68, kids would be on the street corner hanging out and just hanging out to hang out. They would be playing basketball just to play basketball and have a good time. They wouldn't be, purposely, like, I was a basketball player, so I'm interested in basketball culture. And one of the things that's interesting about contemporary urban basketball culture, it's like, it's all a spectacle. It's like, let's play a game, not just to play a game, but to put it on YouTube so we can get college scouts to come. You know what I mean? Like the whole thing, the fun of it and the joy of it and the otherness of it has been totally eviscerated by something like YouTube, where the whole point now is to get likes. It's to get views. It's to have this fun game between kids become monetized and quantified and put into some system of exchange. And that is like, when you really think about that, like when you truly stop and think about that, it is like monstrous. I mean, it is a monstrosity, but the problem is we're not aware of it. Like very, very few people are aware of just how problematic that is. And I think yeah, go ahead.
Well, what's really terrifying about it is that the younger people are going to be less aware of it.
Well, the young people are totally unaware of it. They have no idea what they're doing because they never grew up in an environment of just having that joy of playing, like
they don't even know about talking shit on the street corner. I mean, they don't know about.
Well, yeah, now it's talking shit on Instagram or
right,
Twitter.
But you see, that's not talking shit anymore.
No, it's not. But I mean, that's they think it is.
Yeah. No, so it's like the human friendship has been turned into just one big LinkedIn.
And it's not yet totally.
Do you advance my cash value, for lack of a better term?
Yes. And it's not just my cash value, because of course a lot of these kids don't make a dime from doing that. But it's like this idea that if my social media presence is a certain way and I have a certain amount of likes, that I would generate some kind of value from that, even if it can't be directly monetized.
Right.
And of course it's not just friendship. I mean, something like Tinder is like love. It's like,
well, that's where I was going next.
Yeah, I mean, it's way beyond just friendship. I mean, it's every element of the human experience. And of course, and this is the other thing about this, is that it can't stop itself. It's not like Tinder is just going to stop at like swipe left or swipe right, whatever it is, swipe left, swipe right. It's going to keep going to the point where you can imagine if things keep going the way they're going, there will be like an artificial intelligence algorithm that can like match your brain neurons with another person's brain neuron. Like that's a possibility in 10 years from now.
Oh
So
yeah, I think
this
we're
is
well
like,
on our way. Yeah.
yeah. So like what people don't realize is that technology is not going to stop itself. Like it's not going to stop and say, okay, this is it. We're not going to go any further than that. Of course not. It's going to go way further. It's going to keep going. And this is why there's so many new technologies right now that are in development that are going past the consciousness of the individual directly into the neuronal space. Like, you know, there's this new discipline called neuromarketing. I've been reading about this. I'm very interested in this. And it's like this idea that marketers no longer target the ego, like the conscious ego of the individual. They're bypassing that and going right to their neuronal makeup, right to their neurologic. I mean, so it's like this is what someone like Sanders or AOC, or forget about it, like somebody on the right should talk about this, just anybody. Like this is what has to be brought to the attention of human beings, is like this techno-capitalist process is not going to stop unless someone stops it. Like it's not going to stop. It's going to keep going.
So the things that are really fascinating about all this, and there's a couple, I just want to dial back just a second, is I think that what we've already seen is we've seen the end of romance.
Oh.
So actual seduction, actual having to earn the affection of the other, that's all gone. And so movies that come from, like you say, the 80s or earlier, you know, they're like quaint artifacts of another time.
Oh, yes.
People can't even understand that. But what you're saying about the ego, and I think romance depends on, you know, ego in the neutral sense. You need to have a strong ego structure.
Totally.
Yeah, and to develop that magnetism with another person. But when you look at pathologies like psychosis, what it means if you're a Jungian or something, is that the ego structure now is getting weak. It's getting porous. And so all this stuff from the unconscious is flooding the psyche. When you take hallucinogens, you're doing that kind of deliberately. But what you're saying now that the technology has figured out a way, you know, that they have rendered the ego structure porous through digital means, and now they're just going to bypass that.
Well, that's what they're trying to do. I don't think it's developed fully as of now. But my point is that a process is unconscious. It's not like it doesn't know. Like the idea that Google knows what it wants is so naive. It has no idea what it wants. Like the idea that like the programmers at Facebook know what they're doing. I mean, that's a joke.
Right.
They have no idea what they're doing. They're just going along with a snowball. And the point that I'm making is that this snowball, number one, it's going to keep snowballing. And number two, it's going to keep growing. And the idea that, you know, to take Facebook, for example, the idea that this platform that we have is just going to like stop developing. Okay, cool. Like we have this network to connect with each other, and that, no, it's going to be becoming more and more powerful, more and more algorithmic, and really like more and more violent, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Oh,
so I mean,
yeah.
So that's, and you know, you look at, I mean, a perfect example of what I mean by bypassing the ego is if you watch the film The Matrix from a critical perspective. When that film came out in the late 90s, I mean, that was totally, completely science fiction. You couldn't even imagine that. But now in 2020, I mean, you talk about, you know, Elon Musk has this new company called Neuralink, where it's like linking the human nervous system with the computational. I mean, this is not really, I mean, this is like a legit scientific project right now. So, but the reason why I bring up that film is that's a perfect example where the technology bypasses the conscious ego and goes directly into the neural substrate of the individual. So, I mean, so that's, we're getting a little bit off topic now, but I think it is important just to briefly mention this stuff because, like, we have to find a way to reclaim our age. Like, part of healing from addiction is reclaiming agency. It's reclaiming your power.
That's right.
Yeah.
See, what I'm seeing, especially with a certain younger profile, often men, is exactly what you're talking about. I'm seeing that recovery can't, for a lot of people, you can't even assume the presence of a certain ego strength now. So whatever recovery is going to become, it's going to have to involve building that first. So I see like a lot of young men who their entire lives have been, Ritalin, Adderall, porn, digital porn, and gaming. And so they don't really have any self-structure that comes from playing sports or doing manual labor
Yeah.
or chasing the girl and maybe not getting the girl, maybe getting the girl, losing in sports, winning in sports. They're not enculturated into anything save, and I don't know if you can call this enculturation, save digital devices. So you see, the thing about people like you and me is we come from the earlier time, and we have the tools to be able to reflect on what's happening. And you've made this point already, but these younger folks, it's all they've ever known. The thing about that you were just talking about that's interesting that I came away from having read the chapter by Han was, if capital now is the transcendent, the big other, then technology, medicine, pharmaceuticals, they're like the archangels. They're all serving the big other. And so when I'm talking to people, I see a lot of people, they like to focus on one of the archangels as being the problem. But really,
I would say it's more like the celebrities are the archangels, or I would say that like Kim Kardashian is like Saint Teresa of Avila or something like that.
Well, I think that's been true for a long time. But what I mean by this, is we see critiques out there that want to blame Big Pharma. We see critiques out there that want to blame
yes.
social media. But those beings themselves are serving this larger being, capital.
Totally. Yeah, social media is just, that's what I said. Like, this idea that Mark Zuckerberg knows what he's doing is unbelievably naive. He has no idea what he's doing. He's serving the monster of capital. So like all these companies, they're just doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're just going along for the ride like everybody else. And the fact that they're causing all this damage, this is by no means to excuse all the damage that a pharmaceutical corporation is causing. But at the same time, we have to be aware that these corporations are just following the rules, basically. They're just doing what they're supposed to be doing. Right. So the idea that you can, and this is what I think is like problematic about this idea of quote unquote conscious capitalism. Like, there's all these companies now that, like, they're green companies, or and by the way, Michael Moore's recent film really showed the problematic of this, Planet of the Humans. But it's like, you can't be a conscious capitalist because capitalism is unconscious. Yeah. You can't be it's not really possible to be like a good guy dancing with a monster. You know what I mean? Right. So there has to be an address of the structure, but at the same time, I do think we are to me, it's like we are witnessing the disintegration of capitalism right now, and all the coronavirus and whatever may come in the next few years. I don't think we really have to worry about it. I think it's going to take care of itself. I think the idea, a lot of people on like the critical left, like critical theory, it's like, how do we think about ways to fight back against capitalism? And, a lot of my writing speaks to that. A lot of my writing is less so about what to do, but it's like an analysis of what is. And my feeling is that you don't really have to do anything. It's going to take care of itself. What you have to do is be nice to people, for lack of a better word, is show people tenderness and care and mercy in your day-to-day life. And I think there are things, greater things than these, to quote a line from the Bible, that are happening, and that this process is going to self-destruct on its own accord. And I think
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think there's the incalculable aspect of the human and the spirit that will, you know, nudge it along or light the fire and all that. I do think, though, that there's an inexorable logic. I mean, it's eschaton. It is Girard. It's both things are happening at once. Um, you know, one of the things I think that's going to come out of this COVID financial crisis is that we are going to see the privatization of almost everything now.
Oh, yes.
And because that's the state has to give itself up as collateral to the banks. And I mean, that'll be here. That's what's already happening in other parts of the world. But that's the logic of what's happening now.
Yes. I mean, we haven't, to use an analogy, when your house is on fire, you can't see the damage that's been done. You can't see it till the fire has been put out. And I think we're still in the middle of the COVID fire. So we have no idea the damage that's been done by this. But I think once this virus does dissipate and we are able to gauge the damage, we're not just going to see the damage of COVID. We're going to see the generational damage that has been done to the souls of people in America. And, you know, we're seeing that now in terms of how we recognize the horrific racism that's been part of the American story and what that has done to African American people. And I think at some point that's going to be universalized in the sense that we're going to see how that's been done to everybody and not just Americans, like planet Earth, all the people on planet Earth as a family, I guess, and or like a loose collection of people with some kind of spiritual brotherhood. And I think that is where it has to go eventually. And, you know, we're not ready for that yet. And, but I think that is where it's going to have to go at some point.
Well, I think, yeah. And I think that what we're really seeing is capital is, you know, is basically saying this percentage of the human family is worthless. And that is going to be the brute awakening, whether you are, you know, I mean, if you are multi-generational, poor, white, working class, you've been rendered useless, and people wonder why people voted for Trump. But then what's going to be so amply evident in the third world, where everyone is black and brown, they're going to feel, as usual, they're going to feel the effects of this economically before anybody, or harder than anybody.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous time right now. There's no doubt about it. And, you know, when something like this happens, when the systems of power or oppression are being unveiled for what they are, then you have to be aware for some kind of conflict, right? Because it's not like you know, these banks on Wall Street or these tech companies want people to discover what they're really about, right? So right. my fear is that, or not so much my fear, but my intuition tells me that we are in a martial mode, right? That there could be some kind of geopolitical conflict or you know, or some kind of civil war or something like that. Because that's like, when you get into a situation like this, you tend to get violence. You know, that's what tends to follow from something like this. So that's why, again, coming back to that, I would prefer not to engage in violence. You know, I would prefer not to engage in this. That's the power of a human being to say that, you know? I would prefer not to get into this manufactured debate that's being generated and disseminated by the American media apparatus.
Well, that's right. And I think what's happening is America is morphing into, and this is from both sides of the political spectrum, we're becoming Pravda readers in the late Soviet era. We're finally getting to the point when we open the New York Times or watch Fox or something, we're not taking it at face value, or increasing percentages of Americans aren't. They're trying to read through the lines. They're trying to say, okay, this is what they told us. What didn't they tell us? And that, you know, in my lifetime, I've never seen that kind of distrust of
Sure.
the organs of media and government.
And that, of course, is being caused partially by the background of the digital rhythm. You know, like the New York Times is a literary institution. It's a disciplinary institution. And so is in television to a point, you know? These are analog forms of media. So part of the reason why we don't trust these institutions anymore, besides of their not great reporting, is the fact that in the background, there's always this pulsation of a Twitter feed. There's always this pulsation of a new Facebook story or a new meme or something that's distorting our capacity to read symbolic text. And this also speaks to the, I guess, I don't know if I'd say dishonesty of something like the New York Times, which of course is the flagship American news organization, is the fact that they haven't been critical enough of this metastasizing digital monster. I mean, something like the New York Times is in bed with Google, it's in bed with Facebook, it's in bed with the whole discourse of Silicon Valley. And what the New York Times doesn't fully realize is that Silicon Valley will eat you eventually. It's going to eat you up and spit you out, you know, and there's nothing an analog literary institution like the New York Times can really do to prevent that from happening. So it's really, you know, dancing with the devil, so to speak, you know what I mean? And that's part of the reason why people have, not all people, but many people have started to read the New York Times from a critical point of view, versus saying like, this is the flagship news organization, I totally trust it. That they're losing their grip. And the reason why they're losing their grip partially, and this has nothing to do with maybe a dishonest reporter or anything like that. This has to do with the structural aspect of American society today. You can't have a newspaper like the Boston Globe or the New York Times and expect it to maintain its integrity and kind of narrative power in a digital society. It's not possible. It's not possible. In the same way, it's not possible for an AA meeting to maintain its integrity and digital and its cultural authenticity in a meeting where everyone's texting and watching YouTube. It's not possible. It's literally not possible. So, you know, to link something like the New York Times and AA, these are literary institutions. These are literary cultural formations. And when you start having text messages and YouTube videos and Google searches, these institutions cannot hold their power. They can't.
That's fascinating. So, you know, throughout history, we've seen how the intelligentsia or a cadre of thinkers armed with a potent idea, you know, changed the world. I mean, you know, Plato, few people know anything about Plato, and yet nobody alive was not impacted by Plato. So in this milieu, who is the Byung-Chul Han, and who is the Byung-Chul Han reader in this digital environment? And what is the you know, I don't want to use a word like revolution. What is the agency potential of a writer like Han or a reader of Han?
Well, Han is prophetic. There's no doubt about it. What's unique about Han's writing is that he is both prophetic, but also part of the global theoretical intelligentsia. I mean, he's a serious theorist, but he's also a prophet. So I think, you know, Han, even though he's teaching at a university in Berlin, he's writing from the outside. He's not writing from within academia. He's writing from the exterior of it. In the same way someone like Basquiat painted in the museum from the outside of it, right? Like, I want to make an analogy here. Someone like Basquiat, he took graffiti from the walls of the subway and brought it into the museum. So there was something prophetic about that too. And this is what I would make the analogy with Han. But for me, I think that the world has, like the Western world, the world of America, the world of London, the world of Tokyo, the world of Moscow, the world of Shanghai. I mean, these cultural centers of global capitalism have all been encased in a certain vibration, a certain linguistic field. And I don't really see anything emerging from these places, which is why I went to Peru and lived on. I mean, when I walk through a village in the jungle of the Amazon jungle, or, you know, I've been to Brazil and I've walked through the favelas in Rio, this is where the action is right now. This is where the ideas are. These are the people that can say something. This is the, you know, for lack of a better term, the global proletariat that has something to say. And these are the people that I listen to, you know, even though I read Han and, you know, and I do read the New York Times, and I read, like, my feeling is that the ideas, and this is not really, I'm not saying anything that interesting. The ideas always come from the outside, always. But what's unique about today is that there's such a, like, the dividing line between the inside and the outside is so, it's different than the castle wall of the Middle Ages, because the wall was an actual brick enclosure, whereas today it's like kind of a digital pulsation or something like that. You know, like you can't get good Wi-Fi signal in the Amazon jungle. You know, you can't get good Wi-Fi signal in the favelas of Rio or the barrios of Lima or Lagos. You know, so I do feel as if this is where the action is. This is where the ideas are. This is where the art is. And I think, yeah, like we have to, like I said before, it's like, I don't think we have to do a whole lot. I think things are going to happen. You know, I think this system is in the process of eating itself. And all we have to do in the meantime is we have to take care of ourselves, you know, we have to practice acts of mercy and kindness to the people in our vicinity. We have to be aware of the way capitalism addresses us and what it wants us to do. And then we have to have hope that there's someone out there looking out for us that is going to reveal to us what has happened. That's the way I see it. I mean, I don't by any means think that, you know, to use my own, like, my books are going to change. No, not at all. I mean, I write my books and maybe someone like you gets a hold of them and reads them and is helpful to them. But I mean, I think that we have to just be mindful that what's happening in the world is just so much bigger than all of us, so much bigger, and it's going to happen the way it happens. And all we can do is, you know, even though I'm not really a big fan of Voltaire, I don't really like him at all, but this idea of mending our own garden, I think that's a good attitude to take right now.
It's interesting because I've started thinking in terms of that, with addiction anyway, that the paradigm is shifting, moving away from a biological and individual sense of what addiction is towards one that is rooted in a socio-cultural understanding, that the causes of addiction. And so I've moved from thinking that ideas had the power to change paradigms more to the idea that these ideas, even the ones you and I are talking about, even your work or resistance recovery or Han, are actually symptomatic of the change that's already occurring. And so there are sort of, I'm trying to look at what's going on around me more in terms of context and symptomatology than actual players and agents driving the show. So
yes,
your earlier points are very well taken that, you know, Zuckerberg isn't the mastermind ruining my life.
Oh my God, no.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, Zuckerberg is creating products and algorithms that aren't necessarily great for their users, right? But it's, my point is, like, the idea that he knows what this will do or how it will work or what's happening on, like, the Mac. I mean, this is ridiculous. Bill Gates has no idea what is happening right now in the world. He's trying to know, like all of us, and he has the power to make more influence than the average Joe in, you know, North Dakota or Oklahoma. But the idea that Bill Gates, they're like, to put it in Lacanian terminology, there is no other that knows. There is no other that fully knows what is happening. And, you know, in the conspiracy discourse that we're seeing right now, and by the way, I'm by no means a conspiracy theorist, but I'm sympathetic to people who think outside the box. You know, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with conspiracy theories, and I think most of them are not very intellectually developed. But I think there is something to questioning vaccines, you know, even though I'm not necessarily a hardcore anti-vaxxer. I think there's something to that. And I also think there's something to people who like immediately attack anybody who questions the CNN narrative as a conspiracy theorist. I mean, that to me is very problematic, you know. But I think part of the problem.
To me, that's actually part and parcel of cancel culture.
Oh, I mean, that's a conspiracy theorist in and of itself. I mean, that's even more of a conspiracy theory than the so-called conspiracy theorists. But I guess the point that I'm getting at is that what the problem with most conspiracy theorists is that like they think they know, like they think that like Bill Gates made a phone call to George Soros to unleash the virus in Wuhan. You know what I mean? Like they think there's knowledge about the symbolic order that they can grasp. And the point that I want to make, or at least the way I see it, is like, no, that's not really, first of all, that's giving them way more power than they actually have. You know, the fact that Bill Gates might try to profit or manipulate or do whatever he does, I don't even know anything about Bill Gates, but you know, the fact that he might do that is very different to think that Bill Gates actually knows what the hell is going on right now. He doesn't. He has no idea, just like none of us do, you know?
Very interesting.
He has access to more information, of course. He has, you know, he has relationships with the power players of planet Earth, but that doesn't make him a subject that knows. It doesn't make him like the source of authentic knowledge. It makes him somebody who has some power. You know, that's what it makes him.
Right. What's kind of interesting too is when you start looking at the, you know, some of the higher echelons of power, I suppose this inevitably takes you into conspiracy theory. You start seeing the, I don't want to use the term ideology, but you start seeing the intellectual assumptions of those players morph a little bit. I mean, we know that Gates has a certain eugenic affinity with eugenic ideas. And then we start seeing these other folks that are, you know, I can't remember what's his name, the guy who believes in the singularity. And then,
his name is Ray Kurzweil.
Yeah, Kurzweil. And then, you know, so you see a certain constellation of techno-capital ideas at the top. You do. And you also, I can only assume that the value of those ideas, like we know now that Jeffrey Epstein had a very...
Well, that's a perfect example of a conspiracy. Like that's a perfect example, the whole Jeffrey Epstein saga and the fact that he was connected to all these people. I mean, that's a perfect example, you know?
Right. It's a perfect example, but what I'm saying is, you know, that everything rises must converge, and they're all kind of in the same, not only are they drinking the same cocktails on the same yachts, but they're also buying into a certain ideology that is the current, and I don't hate to use the word ideology, it's the current set of ideas that are dominating the techno-capitalist discourse.
Oh, I mean, these people, I mean, I would actually use a term by St. Paul to describe these people. And what St. Paul calls these people is the powers and principalities.
Yeah.
And St. Paul, who is, to me, is the great intellectual of the West of all time, what he said, and I think this is so important, is like, when he says, like, we are fighting the powers and principalities, because what St. Paul realized is that terrestrial power, like whether it was inscribed into the Roman state or whether it's inscribed into the Wall Street, Silicon Valley axis of today, is that what these people have is they're very dark in the sense that they are against the discourse of Christ, you could say. They're against the salt of the earth. They're against the love of one's neighbor. And their whole project is to create institutions or now technology to prevent this, us from overcoming our own ontological incompleteness, or to have some kind of spiritual awakening, to put it in more commonplace terminology. But I mean, I think what St. Paul said is just is like, we are not waging war against just any type of people. We are waging war against the powers and principalities of this world. And that is very true. And the people who are, quote unquote, running the show right now, these are the forces that Paul called the powers and principalities. And there's no doubt about that. No doubt about that.
Really,
That someone like Bill Gates, but that doesn't mean that they know it. Like, my point is that just because Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation might be doing evil things in Africa, that doesn't make Bill Gates have authentic knowledge. You know what I mean? That just makes him a billionaire, you know?
Well, it doesn't make him believe that he's doing evil. He thinks he's doing good.
Maybe, you know, he might, but that's the whole point. It's like, we could never know that.
Yeah.
You mean, like, we don't know that. So,
well, you know, Simone Weil is very interesting on this. She makes this distinction between gravity and grace, right? I think this really speaks to the no thing. And so she says the world, the one that Paul's talking about, is dominated by the forces of gravity. And the gravity is lust and violence and power, and it's got the quality of necessity to it. There isn't a lot of freedom in it. It's got a kind of a crushing dynamo quality to it. And on the other hand, there is grace. And she says grace is essentially invisible to power.
I love that. That's great.
And that it's a whisper. And,
that's great. And there's a lightness to being with grace. It's not, whereas gravity is heavy.
That's right.
Grace is light. You know, you just really reminded me of something. The two novels that I've reread over the past couple of weeks, or the past couple of months actually. And I think, if I could recommend to the listeners, two great novels that I think really describe this moment. The first one is Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday. And the second is the novel Master and Margarita by the Russian writer, Mikhail Bukhalov. But there's two great novels that are just, oh my God, they are just so descriptive of what's happening right now. But there's this really, really great scene at the way end of Chesterton's novel, The Man Who Was Thursday, where the protagonist of the story, he's this detective agent named Gabriel Syme, and he comes face to face with the head of the agency, who turns out to be God. And what he says is something to the effect like, the whole problem in this world is that we cannot see in front of things. We can only see the backside. He's like, that's not a tree over there. That's the backside of a tree. You know, and it's like, this is exactly like what you just said, quoting Wheel. It's like the gravity is seeing the backside of things, whereas grace is like getting around to the side, getting around to the front and seeing things in a new way. And I think that the whole infrastructure of Silicon Valley capitalism, the whole infrastructure of global capitalism is like jamming the backside of things down people's throats. It's like you're not able to see, like, there's something about that line, and I would really recommend everybody listening to check out that novel. It's one of my favorite novels of all time. But there's something about that line that's so profound. It's like, the whole problem of this world is that we've only seen the back of things. That's not a tree over there. That's the back of a tree. It's like we haven't seen things the way they are. And I think that is, you know, I think as we move forward in the 21st century, where things are changing so quickly, we're going to see like people like us that want to see the front of things, or want to at least have the courage to try to see around things. And we have these powers and principalities that are creating institutions and technology that are forcing people to see the back of things.
Right.
And I think that's the real conflict. Like, the conflict in America today is not between Black people and white people. It's not. Even though there has been systemic racism and all these horrible things that have happened, like, I don't believe for a second that the conflict in America today is between Black people and white people. It's between people who want to see around the side of things and people who still want to look at the backside of things. That's the real conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say the backside of things is everything is rendered calculable, and the seam on the front side of the things is the prophetic.
Yes, I would agree with that. Absolutely.
Well, sir, this has been fantastic. I would really like to have another conversation, especially about your upcoming work.
Yeah, we'll do one more for like a trilogy of talks, right? We're going to do three
Yeah,
parts.
and so maybe can you give the audience a little teaser on what your coming book is about?
Well, I'm working on a few different books right now, but the two main ones are the second volume of the hypermodern trilogy that I'm writing with two other people, John David Ebert and Michael Aaron Kamens. So we already put out the first installment, which is called Hypermodernity and the End of the World, and now we're working on the second. We're just about done with the second installment, and that is should be out this fall. And then the other project that I've been working on is a book about the French anthropologist René Girard, who's probably, you know, if not I have a lot of people that have influenced me a lot, but he's definitely one of them. So that's my other main thing that I'm working on right now. And then I'm working on some stuff down in the Ketos, like a photography project that I've been working on down there and some different things. And I'm hoping to, I'm stuck here in America right now. So I'm anxiously waiting for international flights to reopen so I can get back to my life in Peru. But in the meantime, this has been a good time for me because I've been doing a lot of writing. I've been, perfecting my Spanish, which has been nice. And, taking a lot of online Spanish classes and then working on these new writing projects. So it's been a productive time for me for sure.
All right, Mr. Culkin. Well, we look forward to hearing from you again, and I will be in touch.
All right, Pierce. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And, it's really great what you're doing with your resistance recovery community and all the work that you've, just doing it. Like, I think what you bring to recovery as a person with your experience and your knowledge is really important, not just for your group, but for the world, I guess I'd say. Anybody who could find what you're doing will be greatly benefited from working with you. So I want to tip my hat to you for that.
Well, much appreciated.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you soon.
All right, man.